So I want to show you some surface decorating techniques that require removing clay. So everybody sort of quickly takes to carving and decorating, and they draw some lines in, use a stylus to draw lines, or some sort of loop tool to carve in lines. But people tend to be a little bit timid, and I want to encourage you not to be timid. So I want to show you two techniques, one of which is called faceting, and that is basically just any kind of pattern of cuts where you're removing chunks of clay. I'm using a sort of medium-sized throwing loop for this. It could be done with a larger or smaller loop depending how much clay you have. For pieces where your work has gotten too thick, this can actually be a really useful tool or technique for removing a bunch of clay. But it's also useful for creating an interesting surface. Now I happen to be carving away on a surface that's fairly wet, and it's making that kind of mark. If I have a surface that's a little bit drier, it's going to leave a slightly different mark. And you can do this technique at leather hard, at wet, or somewhere in between. So I'm getting bits sticking back onto here, but you can see how these cuts are a little bit cleaner. They don't have as much bumpiness as these cuts over here. Both of these cuts on the edge, I've got a little bit of ridge happening here, and I would recommend you actually wait until it's dry or mostly dry to clean those up. As you go to clean up these edges, you can see I'm kind of smearing a little bit. They're going to be easier to clean up, and they won't have these little bits if you wait until you're done. So that's faceting, and here's a nice example of a faceted piece where somebody has cut out a bunch of little marks. Now theirs are fairly shallow, but they've used a glaze that then pools in those deeper areas, so you can get a sense of that texture, and the texture also changes the color. Now a very similar technique is called fluting, and this is one I don't actually have a good example in the studio, but I want to have one. So if somebody wants to make me one, I would be very happy. But this technique, and I'm doing it on an extruded piece, but you could do it on the wheel. In fact, this is a really useful technique if you're throwing on the wheel and your piece is too thick. But it can also be useful for hand building decoration and for, in this case, an extruded piece that's kind of thick. So fluting is just creating those cuts with a loop tool all the way up, so up in a pattern. In fact, I've got a beautiful bowl at home that I should try to bring in someday that has facets that come, fluting, that come all the way up and around the bowl. And because they go at a curve as they work around, they give a sense of kind of movement to the whole bowl. Now, of course, just like the piece with the faceting, glaze can really highlight the textures that we have going on here. This is a wiggle wire. It's just a wire tool, except it's wiggly. We have a couple of these in the studio. And this can also be used to get something that looks very similar to faceting and fluting. Now this is another one, you want to make sure you have enough thickness. But when you cut that off, you get that pattern of lines. You also have this, which could then be attached onto something and has that pattern of lines. But it gives you that sense of texture, right? Of movement, of line, pattern. And look how fast I did it. It was really quite simple to do, and it added a lot of, or it removed, excuse me, a lot of clay. Now, another thing you guys can always do is cut the edges, but don't forget when you cut, you aren't stuck with one angle. I'm, in this case, cutting this top edge to create a kind of curve, but also to have slightly different edges happening here. I could, do the same thing through here. So there's lots of cutting tools, but they can be used lots of different ways. My biggest kind of pet peeve is when people get stuck simply drawing, simply doing some lines. These loop tools can give you thin, shallow lines, deep, thick lines. You can really get a lot of clay cut away. You can mix short marks and long marks, and deep marks and shallow marks. We have lots of these kinds of loop tools, but we also have some of these fancy ones. And there's different types here, but these are designed to give you kind of a more a feeling like working with a pencil. They work on leather hard or wet, and it's a really smooth cut. They're quite sharp. They're kept up by the phone or in my my locker area just because they are kind of expensive, and I don't want to have to replace them often. But they can be used to carve. The one that's a little funny is this one here. It kind of is hard to get a sense of when you're first starting, but you use it this way, and you can drag your line. If you try to use it the other way, you'll find out pretty quick that it's not very comfortable. So go ahead and play with these. Try some things out. These can give you lines that feel like you're drawing, feel like you're working with a pencil rather than with wet clay. I think that's all of my special separate tools specifically, but any tool can be used to press into, cut into, remove clay, right? This is just a rubber tip tool, and this is not what I normally use it for. I thought, hole cutter too. I've got a hole cutter here, but it's buried. There it is. And hole cutters can be used, of course, for just simply cutting holes, decorations, if you want to make a colander or like a candle holder that shines light through. But you can also use these in combination, so you can use them as the start of cutting out another kind of shape. You might do it a little bit more carefully than me. Lots of tools that can be used to remove clay. So if you come to me and say, I've got this bowl or I've got this cylinder that I've created and it's too thick, and I say to you, take some clay off. These are a whole bunch of ways that you can take that clay off. Thanks.